Welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining this video town hall on opening the checkbook, assessing COVID-19 income supports. My name is Karim Bardeesy. I'm the Executive Director and co-founder of the Ryerson Leadership Lab at Ryerson University. And this is our fourth video town hall with the First Policy Response Project. First Policy Response is a project of the Brookfield Institute for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, the Ryerson Leadership Lab, and Matthew Mendelson. And our goal is to bring the Canadian policy community together to highlight the best economic and social policy ideas to keep us afloat and together during the COVID-19 crisis. Our focus is on those ideas that can get us through the immediate crisis, and perhaps more importantly, as we prepare for a transition, to make sure that that transition is sustainable and equitable. And we hope that members of the policy community engage with us, and we welcome participation from frontline leaders and policymakers, the private sector, labor, academia, and the not-for-profit sector. And it's good to see for some familiar names and faces as part of those communities with us today. And we're especially keen to add voices and organizations that bring diversity to our group and to this work. The First Policy Response Initiative does three main things. We aggregate the best content that we're seeing out there through our Twitter handle, our newsletter, and our website. We publish original material, and we're open to your pitches, which you can send to our managing editors, Stephanie McClellan and Sahar Shafiq. And we do gatherings and convenings like this one to bring the policy community with engaged citizens and others together to better understand what's happening and to respond to it. Before we begin, I'd like to give a land acknowledgement. We do this as a symbolic restorative act, one of many to follow and part of a wider and hopefully transformative reconciliation project at Ryerson University. Ryerson and where I'm speaking from right now are both on the territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat. It's covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, Treaty 13, and the Williams Treaties. We are committed to honoring our obligations to these nations' treaties and to justice for Indigenous peoples generally. In this project, we hope to do that by publishing original material related to Indigenous realities and the many Indigenous realities that are touched by this crisis, and to help shine a light on the differences that are experienced by Indigenous peoples through this crisis, and to be mindful of the many different policy alternatives that need to be articulated for them and for that purpose. This project this video town hall project is one where we hope to gather and to share insights and to serve not only as a platform for insights, but a platform for potential activation. And one of the ways we'll do that is in our breakout rooms, which will take place around 50 minutes into this conversation. We will have 30 minutes approximately in conversation with our panelists. We'll be taking some questions from the Slido web platform, and Sahar Shafiq will give some instructions on that through the chat box. You can go to www.sli.do and enter the code. What's the code?
It's FPR3. I'm going to add it to the chat box right now.
FPR3. So we'll start taking your questions from there. You can start putting them in there right now. And we'll have breakout rooms where you've been assigned randomly. Each of our panelists will be joining that breakout room with the moderator, and it's a chance for a deeper conversation around anything that was discussed, and also a potential platform for people to meet each other and activate further around the issues here. I'll welcome our panelists now. We're very, very fortunate to have a great panel. In fact, there's so much rich material and richness of thought in our panel and in this work that we're actually having this conversation around the same time as another conversation that's happening at Ryerson. One of the democracy dialogues is treating a somewhat similar topic area on the future of work, and they've got Dina Ladd from the Workers' Action Center and Pedro Barada from the Future Skills Center. Because their conversation has some relationship with ours, after this conversation, we will send you information about both our town hall and their town hall, and try to get some information, make sure that you can tune into their recording after the fact. Our panelists come to us from across Canada and have experiences and backgrounds in public policy in applied research, and in academia. And we're really thrilled to have such a diverse panel join us today. With us from Cardis is Brian Dijkema, Vice President of External Affairs with Cardis. His work explores the relationships between governments, markets, civil society, natural and voluntary associations, and looks to establish the conditions for mutually enabling relationships between these various spheres of private and public life. A really important call to action at this point in time. And you may have seen his work with Sean Spear calling for a matching fund for voluntary contributions early in this crisis. We're also joined by Jennifer Robson, Associate Professor of Political Management at Carleton University and at Kroger College. Jennifer, prior to joining Carleton, worked in the Government of Canada and spent nearly a decade in the voluntary sector, holding senior roles in policy development and research. You would be familiar with some of her work if you've been following this crisis closely, for the very action-oriented, useful resources that she's been publishing online around income supports, and really being on the front lines of assessing and advising on how these income supports should be playing out. We've got Mike Moffatt, Senior Director for Policy and Innovation at Smart Prosperity Institute. Mike is also an assistant professor in the Business Economics and Public Policy Group at the Ivey Business School at Western University in London. Mike was the Chief Innovation Fellow for the Government of Canada in 2017 and has held a variety of positions in academia and in public policy in Canada. And with Mike, we get a bit of a twofer. We get Mike's expertise in climate change, but we also get his really diligent attention to the labor market and industrial policy of Canada. Again, someone who has been very active on Twitter and publishing in a variety of places on those themes. Finally, we have monikadutt, Medical Officer of Health in Newfoundland and Labrador, and a family physician in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, joining us today from Sydney, Nova Scotia. She's a board member and past chair of Canadian Doctors for Medicare. She has an interest in promoting healthy public policies with a focus on areas such as equitable access to high quality health care, poverty reduction, and climate change. Wonderful to have Monica join us and speak to us not only about the lived impacts of this crisis on the patients and the populations she's seeing, but on the interplay of how income and income support can really make or break the lives of people in this crisis. And so we're really, really lucky to have Monica. So welcome all of you. I want to start with, and we're going to get some acronyms going here. And so maybe Sahara, I don't know if you can, you might want to drop in the feed at some point, the Canada.ca COVID-19 response website, so people can get a sense of all the acronyms and all the income support. We're talking today about all the supports that primarily the federal government has brought to bear on this crisis, crisis now being over 2 months in, and the income support programs being designed in record time and still flowing out to people. So let's start with the two major programs that were first touching a lot of people and may be touching people on this call, either as employers or as recipients. Let's speak about the major programs, the CERB, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, and CEWS, the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy in particular. What were these programs, and what were they trying to achieve, and how are they doing? And maybe Jennifer, we can start with you as someone who's given some commentary on those already.
Sure, I'll do my best here. Two benefits that were essentially launched in very quick succession, and I would say actually probably record time for policy development. In terms of the purpose, I think the purpose was actually pretty straightforward. So I've been using this metaphor of trying to put the economy into a medically induced coma, right? Because of public health orders and restrictions in terms of safe work and safe activity, we needed to find ways to enable people to still make ends meet while practicing social distancing, and to try and do as much as possible to preserve the relationship between employer and employees. So these programs were put in place recognizing that the existing infrastructure that we had, namely employment insurance, sickness benefits, couldn't keep up with demand. And sorry, I would add regular benefits to that as well, couldn't keep up with demand, and also didn't cover enough workers. So in terms of how are they working? That's a really hard thing for me to assess right now, given the paucity of data that we've got. What we know is that, especially through CERB, so that's the emergency response benefit, it's being paid out both by CRA as well as Service Canada. Money is flowing quickly. The overall volume of claims from individual people seems to match up with what we're seeing in terms of labor force disruptions, both either temporary layoffs or people who essentially have a job but 0 hours for pay. So that's all good. The CEWS, I think, is the way that people are pronouncing that one, the wage subsidy. So far, that take-up has been less than originally hoped for and anticipated. And I think the real question is, what does the future look like for each of those two programs, where the goal is not now necessarily to have people stay home, but the goal is to encourage people to resume or regain safe work or to do safe job search. And so how do we figure out those incentives? And that's not going to be a simple problem to solve.
Thank you, Jennifer. That's really great beginning overview. Brian, do you want to just take on what you're seeing from these benefits and their design?
I think Jennifer did a pretty good job, and she's probably the best person to ask. Jennifer, you've been doing great work on putting all that stuff together and actually doing tremendous public service just by educating us on Twitter. I think Jennifer is right. There's a sense in which we're doing as good a job as we can under the circumstances. The speed and the volume of these, both of them, both CERB and CEWS and all the rest is incredible. So I don't know that, I don't think I have anything much to add other than that to note something that I'll probably bring up at a later point is that these are, the bigger challenge is going to be on coming out, the flip side of it. And also one of the challenges is we're really focusing on the cost of this program, what is going out, how much are people bringing in right now. But one thing just to highlight is that there are also costs associated with being out of work. And those costs are social, those costs are, have to do with health and can sort of ripple through. And so I just want to encourage us as we're thinking through these income supports and acknowledging them as being very, very good work done on very little time. And I think if you look internationally, we're doing probably among the best in the developed world. We're right up there and doing quite well. But there's certain costs that come from being out of work that even a decent or even a really well-made benefit is not going to address. So just something to note.
Yeah, and that's an important insight, especially since we saw that the first benefit that actually got extended was the emergency wage subsidy, the emergency response benefit. So the wage subsidy giving a subsidy to keep employment, at least keep an employment relationship, whereas the emergency response benefit did not have that effect yet. And we are still waiting to hear what the future of that emergency response benefit is. It expires in a matter of weeks. Is there a way to, in the current economy, especially since given the assessment that Jennifer made around putting the economy into a coma, is there a way to design these benefits to encourage work, given the selective places in which work is allowed to happen? And Brian, I'll leave that to you, but also maybe throw it to Mike after that as well.
Yeah, I think that's the real challenge, right? This is, as Jennifer noted, normally when we design income replacement programs, they have a strong pro-work component to them. And I think actually Canada's done a better job of that than a lot of other nations in terms of designing our income replacement programs to not discourage work, to encourage it, to in fact, I think this government and past governments have done a good job of easing out that ramp so there's not a hard wall to getting off of them. But in this case, in the fact that people are staying home is the point. We need people to stay at home so that we can address the health issues that will be inevitable if everybody starts going and returning to normal and doing what they want to do anyways, right? And so we're stuck in a bit of a situation where the income is there, but all of those effects of being out of work, challenges with depression, lifestyle, all the rest of that stuff that we've noted in various papers with Dr. Gunderson, who I see on this call. the design is to ensure that we don't go to work until such a time as there are, the public health officials say that it can. So I'd say that's the real catch-22, and moving certain workplaces that require people to be in a certain physical place and providing an ability for them to do work even on a lesser scale is very challenging. That's the big challenge, perhaps.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Mike, do you want to pick up on this? And I know you also wanted to talk about one of the new programs that's just been announced.
Yeah, so I would say, I mean, that is going to be a difficult problem, getting people back to work when all of our programs are designed to essentially keep them home. We'll have to see when things reopen how much difficulty firms will have in attracting workers. Would people rather just stay at home and collect these benefits, or go to work? My sense is that there are enough people out there who would like to work, that I don't think that is going to be an issue. I think firms could offer enough money for available workers. If the federal government thought that wasn't enough, it could do, wage top-ups or things like that. The one area where I have concern is that people might want to work, but their family situation just doesn't allow it. You can actually see my 5-year-old keeps passing that door behind me. Now, I'm gainfully employed, and I'm one of those positions that could work from home. But if I can work from home right now, and the economy was opening up, and some retail store was hiring positions, I couldn't take that job, right? There's nobody there to look after the 5-year-old and the 8-year-old. So I think that's going to be the real trick on this, is navigating the childcare piece, because you can offer all the money in the world, but if there's nobody there to look after the kids, and that's just difficult to do, then we're not going to get that take up. And yeah, and since Karim asked as well, there's a whole alphabet soup here of programs, and one that came out last week that was a little bit controversial is called LEAF, LEEFF. And I'm horrible with acronyms, but the large, I'm just reading it off screen, Large Employer Emergency Financing Facility, which is designed to help large firms, so firms over $300 million in revenue, basically stay solvent. It's the government will offer them loans under a certain set of conditions. And we don't know exactly what those set of conditions are yet. We have a rough idea. But I just wanted to bring this up because there was a lot of debate. Andrew Coyne and others were basically upset that the federal government was, first of all, putting conditions on these loans. To my mind, it's just that's ridiculous. I mean, every loan by its nature has at least one condition. You got to pay it back. But on top of that, you layer other conditions around interest rates. And, if I'm get a mortgage, I can't go out and spend that money on hockey cards, so any loan has a set of conditions. But people were really upset by one in particular. And that was that companies who obtain this loan would have to engage in climate disclosures. And we got into this debate about whether or not, this basically, is it appropriate for the federal government to put environmental conditions on a loan? And I think this became problematic because it became this sort of either or thing. In my mind, those conditions are an economic condition. The federal government should be hoping that firms can transition out of these loans and then get financing in the private sector from private sector, from banks, pension funds, and that kind of thing. And we're seeing all across the world, like BlackRock, like the Norwegian, the Norwegian oil fund, that companies or that these big funds are resisting making investments in companies that they don't see as climate friendly. And one of the ways to not be climate friendly is not to disclose, disclose all your sort of climate risks. So I would just say that, again, that this is a bit of a tangent, but I think we need to understand in this, coming reality that this is not, these conditions are not just environmental versus economic, that these conditions are helping companies achieve, be able to transition from government loans to private sector loans. So it's a bit of a rant, but I work at an environmental NGO, so I've got to sort of throw that in there.
Mike, that's really important. Thank you for that. And it raises, I think, two questions I want us to get at throughout this panel, and that might inform the conversations with others as well. One is the extent to which the income support side's been so big, but the condition for an economy restart isn't only about income support, it's about those other supports. And right now, the spend has really been massively tilted on the income support side. I want to get those conditions you talked about in a second, but there's also a second consideration here, which is you mentioned that the firm hiring behavior, the firm rehiring or re-engagement behavior, it's not quite clear what's going to happen. I've seen some concern articulated out there that either the wages being offered by companies right now, as tough as it is for many of them, just aren't enough to encourage that participation back in the labor market. And that's before we get into the question of childcare and other questions like that. So do you want to just comment briefly on that, how much more does a company have to pay above and beyond CERB or an employer to get someone into the workplace?
It's hard to say, and in my mind, it should just normally be that the market should figure that out, and that wages should adjust appropriately. That gets a little bit more difficult in certain sectors where Canada is affected by international competition, and we have to make sure that our firms remain cost competitive. And the one I'm thinking of in particular is agriculture, which has had real trouble attracting employees because it's a sector that depends heavily on temporary foreign workers. And first of all, we think of this as unskilled labor, but it's really not. A lot of these temporary foreign workers are in agriculture are very, very highly skilled. They're hard to replace. Now, because of all the lockdown, we can't get them up here. There's no place for them to stay. So we have to find those skills in the sort of domestic economy, which is first of all difficult to do. And then secondly, we have to find them at a wage where they won't get completely undercut by Americans or other, other countries' agricultural sectors, which are very heavily subsidized. Because essentially, for the most part, these agriculture producers are producing commodities and tend to earn commodity profits. So, it really depends sector by sector. And on the one hand, the big retailers like Walmart and Amazon, I'm a little less concerned. They can adjust their wages until they find sort of a market clearing wage. But in sectors that have a certain level of skills, are really exposed to foreign competition, I think, like agriculture in particular, I think those are the ones where we might see some tensions.
That's really helpful intervention. Thank you, Mike, and we'll follow that one closely. You can also see the First Policy Response website for a piece by Sylvain Charlebois, which treats the macro agriculture issues. Let's now go on to Monica. And Monica, been talking about how generally well these funds have worked in terms of at least flowing money to people. What are you seeing on the ground with respect to how people are reacting to and receiving the funds? And how are you seeing the health situation with the people that you're seeing or that you oversee play out a little bit?
Yeah, I feel like the odd one out on this panel. I'm definitely not an economist and don't have that background, but I also think it's really important. Mike was just talking about, it's not environment or economy. I think I felt like sometimes it's, health or economy or health, that those conversations haven't been happening enough together. And I think partly just out of just the sheer need to respond to what was happening urgently. But normally, public health, for example, we're very much looking at, broadly what creates a healthy community. And part of that is having decent work, having a living wage, having, adequate income supports. And that's part of health. Whereas now public health has been incredibly focused on, the disease and the testing and the, making sure we contain illness from spreading further and dealing with outbreaks. And I think that's all very necessary. But then, health is so much broader than that, as others have also said. So both as, a family doctor, I work in a clinic where people are quite marginalized. They're put at risk for a whole range of different reasons. They're in precarious housing. They, don't have access to decent work. There's all kinds of reasons why they're already at risk. And this has put them at even more risk of all kinds of different health conditions. Of course, from a public health perspective, we're seeing how the disease both has a disproportionate impact on people who are in precarious work situations, who are, so-called essential work, not so-called, but who are essential. But essential workers often mean, often people who are racialized, people who are in jobs where they might not have as much choice to be able to work at home. So I think it's really, as many people have now commented on, the disparities that already existed are exacerbated even more now. So from a health perspective, I think we really need to get back to thinking of health broadly, which means economic well-being. It means, being free from illness as much as possible. It's bringing all of these areas together to create health. And I think part of that, of course, are these emergency income supports, which I think are necessary. But as we go forward, I think we really need to think about, building up again, how do we create healthier communities through thinking creatively, as well as building on the fact that we know these disparities exist and we can deal with them, whether it's childcare. I have an 8-year-old downstairs with no one looking after him. So I'm not sure what's going on, but so many have to deal with childcare, as well as all the other supports that have to be in place. And I think that's all part of the economic and health discussion.
Thank you, Monica. And I guess a preface I should have added at the outset, and that maybe Sahar, we can add to future prefaces for future events, is just a recognition of the circumstances in which everyone who's participating in this panel, not just the panelists and moderator, but and the organizers, but all the participants are participating in this panel in challenged circumstances, and probably speak for, or attempt to speak for, or represent, or attempting to represent those who are even in more challenged circumstances and aren't able to participate by virtue of their work needs or their inability to access the proper technology. So I want to recognize that as well in this conversation. And so maybe to build on that, Monica, what can you just speak to some of the trends that you're seeing in either the patients you see or the patients you have responsibility for in your practice and in your professional obligation? What are some of the things that you're perceiving that can really make tangible that inequality and that stress that you said at the outset?
I think there's lots of policies we could be looking at, but I'll pick a few in particular. So I had been already quite involved with work around universal publicly funded national pharmacare. And I think, again, disparities that existed before with people who could only access, who either didn't have access to drug coverage and couldn't afford their essential medications. And then you had another group who did have it through an employment. And so seeing that having a system where people's access to essential medications for their health is tied to their employment, and then they can lose their employment in such a drastic way. So I've seen people who no longer are able to pay for the medications that they could not that long ago afford, still those people in the middle of either not being able to access a publicly funded program or just have enough income that they can't access support programs. So that's been quite common. Also the fact that, public health itself is an institution that has not been terribly well funded when you look at health in general. So in overall, public health is funded about 1% to 2% of an overall healthcare budget. And we come into the spotlight with something like this, but for the most part, it's kind of behind the scenes. It's, designed to try to keep people healthy in a way that's not kind of right in front of you every day, but working to create healthy policies that, you have more access, say, to places to be outdoors or to be active or to bike or things like that you might not think about. But in a crisis like this, it really becomes clear the need to support public health. So kind of on the ground as a public health worker, we're working with what we have. We're trying to expand as we can and bring people on as we can, and do the work that we need to do. But definitely it's a challenge, especially when you're still trying to do at least some of the other work that you normally did that keep people healthy. But it's difficult to do that. And of course, in healthcare, people know that so many services had to be cut back, both to prepare for what could happen and is happening. So people have also not been able to access those needed healthcare services.
Thank you. That's a helpful intervention, because we've heard in the wake of or during this crisis calls for various new or ramped up programs. Pharmacare is not one that we hear necessarily in the headlines as much as some of the others. So it's helpful to hear that you make that connection for us. I think it's also important to take what you said and just pull a little bit on the thread of how we divvy up a healthcare budget. I think it'll be important and interesting to follow how healthcare budgets are being divvied up during this crisis, because we know a lot of the kind of conventional work of our healthcare systems has been slowed or put off, which might have its own health impacts. Are you seeing any of that yet in terms of people not being able to? We've heard some evidence that the delays in procedures are having a real impact, at least in Ontario, where I am right now.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all the things that are maybe not considered urgent or emergency, but definitely for quality of life. And again, that ties into the ability to work, the ability to contribute economically. You need to be as healthy as possible to be able to do that. So people have not been able to access both kind of even care that is more needed, but perhaps not an emergency, and then the so-called elective type of procedures or care. And I think there's just this transition period also. So as a family doctor, I've switched over to, all video and phone clinics, but for the first few weeks, it was incredibly quiet as people, I think, just adjusted and tried to figure out what's going on and who's there. And we know that people are likely putting off care either in emergency or in primary care as they also adjust. And at least where I am, we are just starting to open up different services. And so that will be, again, a slow progression. So undoubtedly, there have been some challenges. I will say, for the most part, if something needs to be done, I've been able to figure it out. You make an appointment to get your blood work done or an appointment to get x-rays. So things are still getting done, and people are working really hard to make sure people have care. But there are people who have not been able to access needed care.
Brian, I know you wanted to make a commentary on this connection between the health aspect and the income support aspect. So I don't know if there are comments that Mike or Monica have made that you want to pick up on or want to tease out a bit more.
Well, I'll give way to Dr. Robson. She had her hand up first, I think, and then
sorry.
That's okay.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, no, I'm afraid, I think my intervention now is going to take us on a different tangent. So I'm going to encourage Brian actually to follow up on the relationship.
I was going to say the same thing. I would actually, well, then I'll just take it on and we'll stop being these little chipmunks that say you first, no, you first. Just a couple of things. One responding to Mike's, and another one on the childcare thing, which I think is critical and key to discuss. Mike noting that sort of the markets will figure out, and some of the challenges in places where markets can't quite figure out, whether it's temporary foreign workers in agriculture, where there's challenges for normal market functions to work. The other one is in this gets to healthcare, which is in the long-term care homes. And here we have a situation, we've done some work at Cardis on the challenges related to employment for personal support workers who make up the bulk of the, they're sort of the frontline infantry, if you want to call it that. I don't like using war as a metaphor, but they're the sort of very, very frontline in terms of caring for our aged. And there's been real challenges in terms of labor supply. A lot of people don't want to go to work because acuity of residents has gone way up and wages have gone down. They've actually over the last decade lost wages. And when you look at how we're going to solve that, it's very, very difficult. It's not simply a question of introducing more market into it. There would be, I think that's some of that, but the fact is government is the sort of primary funder of that, and government funds are not easy to come by, particularly in a healthcare envelope that has grown and grown and grown. And so I think what that does, and this is it sort of, I think it should be forcing us to think a little bit more deeply about the structures that we've built around some of these social policy questions and their relationship to the economy. And I think childcare is another one. So many of you may have seen, I think Dr. Robson's doing really great work, and there are a few economists who are doing really, really good work showing the importance of childcare if we want to restart. As Mike noted, he has a 5-year-old and an 8-year-old. Dr. Dutt has an 8-year-old. I've got a bunch of kids running around too. You might see them in the back of this. Those are real challenges for all of us. And so I think it's an important challenge, but I just want to encourage us to think again about what the nature of that challenge is and what the structures we're trying to do and what should take priority. And I think one of the challenges when we're talking about daycare is that we can prioritize the economy and economic growth at the cost of the family. And I think there's a real challenge. So for instance, there was an article today, I think it was in the Globe and Mail, talking about childcare, and it was a good article. It talked about the importance of it. But the link there is that childcare is necessary for economic growth. And I think while that's true, that shouldn't be the primary lens through which we think of childcare. We should think of childcare in terms of the care for the child. And I don't want to be the resident Marxist on this panel because I know you brought me in as this sort of the other side. But there's a real problem when you start taking the family and thinking about how we're going to structure the family in service of the economy, when in reality, the economy should be in service of the family. And so when we're talking about building structures to build childcare, we should be thinking about what are structures that are going to be best for the child, not best for GDP growth, as important as GDP growth is, and what structures are going to be best for the child in ways that enable institutions that are best sort of to do that. And so I would say on that issue, that actually sort of frames the way I think we should be thinking about social policy vis-a-vis the COVID crisis and the economy, which is that we should be trying to emphasize diffused policies that enable civil society and enable the various institutions which provide the care that it's aimed at, rather than trying to subsume it into the economy. My concern is that because we've spent so much money and because the economy, which really does matter, and again, I don't want to underplay the importance of economic growth, but just to realize the economy isn't everything. There are a whole bunch of things, whether it's education and so on, childcare, that we need to be thinking about. And if we're structuring our policies about childcare or education or care for the elderly in terms of what's most economically expedient or what's most likely to contribute to the GDP, I think we're really missing out on something.
That's a really helpful intervention, Brian. And I see we've got Kate Bezanson and Andrew Bevan on our on this video town hall as well. And so maybe they've written a piece for First Policy Response, which may have helped instigate that Globe Mail article today. We don't know. Sahara, maybe you could drop that in the chat as well. And I have the benefit of seeing Kate in my gallery here and seeing her reacting to some of your comments. And so this is a really helpful intervention. I hope it opens up the kind of conversation that we're going to need to have. One of the privileges of having a diverse panel and having some folks like you, and being in a situation where although there is still tremendous urgency in a number of places, we can think a bit about the future, is the benefit of having conversations around those deeper questions and to question some assumptions potentially around how some of those deeper questions are being put forward. So it's really important, and I appreciate you doing that, Brian. Jennifer, you wanted to make an intervention, maybe on this, maybe on something else.
Well, and actually now, Karim, I'm just realizing sort of time and sensitive to the long list of questions that you sent us ahead of time. So I'm actually going to defer to you in terms of what question you would like to. Okay.
Well, I have two that I want to pick up on, and I want to get to Slido soon too. So Sahara, a reminder Sahara's already posted. You see in the chat, slido.com, code FPR3 to put questions, and perhaps more importantly, to vote up questions. And I think Brian's intervention, I almost might call it a provocation, puts my next question in a bit of a different light. The thing that we're seeing now, and I don't think this is necessarily ideological left or right, although you might have those on the left more excited about this prospect. You've seen discussions now about the need for universal programs or new programs, and how this crisis illustrates the need for, or proves out the point yet further for a program that someone might want to champion. And we've already had a few programs mentioned so far. Is there one of those, and maybe I'll do a quick straw poll. Is there one program that each of you would see, yes, that really needs to be part of the future as part of the rebuild? We need this one, there's one program that's absolutely essential. And if so, what is it? And if not, or if you want to take issue with the question, please do so. Whether you think that's the right way of even seeing this. Maybe Jennifer, you want to take a stab at that?
Okay, so if I'm understanding the question correctly, it's given the full menu of what's been launched, what do we definitely need to keep for the recovery and rebuild period?
That's right, and
yeah?
what it might need to look like, or is that the wrong way to think about this?
Okay, so I tend to think about this in sort of almost three different phases. That we've had sort of the acute crisis phase where we did need to do the shutdown. We're now at the very early stages of trying to do the reopen. And I don't think that we're in a position to even imagine what true rebuild looks like for an extended period of time. Certainly not until we have some sort of vaccine or reasonable treatment that is widely available, right? So I'm just kind of postponing most of my thinking on that particular piece. I think the short answer to your question is that it's not just one program, right? It's actually we need multiple forms of intervention, and that's where some modified version of, like, I think we have to figure out, for example, what is going on with the wage subsidy. The take up has not been quite as strong as hoped for, and make some adjustments there. Regardless of that, there's going to be some ongoing need for some period of time for some income support for folks who aren't covered by the EI system. Given the volume constraints the EI system can handle, there's going to need to be some supports there. Childcare and access to education for kids is going to remain incredibly important, and that this is one of those things that keeps me up at night, thinking about over the course of the next coming months, what's the potential impact, particularly for parents with kids, and especially for moms, right? Because in as much as we're now entering into a phase where we're hoping that more employers and employees will be suddenly reunited, as many of the other panelists here have already mentioned, having children that you must continue to care for remains a really important constraint on that. And there's just been such a patchwork of response across the country in terms of schools and childcare and day camps. I heard there was an announcement today in Ontario. So there's that element of it in terms of that recognition of the presence of children and other, frankly, unpaid care responsibilities continuing to play a major role here. So there isn't going to be one magic program that can resolve all of these issues. And to me, the bigger issue is what is the mix of programs going forward? And that's going to get trickier and trickier, right? Because a lot of the way that we are used to handling individual differences in programs is by having fairly lengthy, complex application forms with long bits of verification. Think about your standard employment insurance, regular benefits application, right? In normal times, you could refuse work because you felt that your workplace was unsafe. And I think that's going to be a major concern. So in addition to whether or not wages are high enough to encourage people to come back to work, I think there are huge workplace safety issues that people need to be thinking about as well. And, in normal times, we assumed that the system provided enough resources and supports so that people who had concerns about workplace safety had somewhere to complain, and that an investigation could take place in a timely manner. I don't know that we actually have systems in Canada that can handle that on the kind of scale that we may be dealing with in the next couple of months. So there's that element as well, that there's going to be sectoral differences, workplace differences. I'm sorry, I don't have like a silver bullet for you. I think what I'm trying to say is we're going to have to continue walking and chewing gum, but figuring out increasingly complex ways to do that in the next couple of months.
And that's a really important flag that the labor relations policy and workplace safety policies need to be working at top speed as well. And there needs to be a feedback back to employers who can then not only provide what is needed, but then also so that employees and the workers have an ability to litigate or find a path to have options where they those provisions aren't given. And as you noted, even at the best of times, it's not easy to be informed of those. On the other town hall, I'm sure Dina Ladd is speaking about that right now. I think everyone here has, or even as a former worker, as a worker present or former ourselves, would have that sense. Anyone else want to take on the question? And this is related to the top-voted question by Edward C., who's also a physician and might have some other inputs on this. Edward writing, basic income is hot but has drawbacks, and alternative universal basic services focuses on solidarity, efficiency, and access based on need. So again, does anyone else want to take on this question of what are the next programs and the program mix and considerations around the design of those? Mike?
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I would agree with Jennifer that, you know, everybody's talking about the current situation where we have the medically induced coma, the restart, then the recovery, and we're kind of hand waving this restart. And frankly, I hate the term restart. My colleague John McNally and I have an op-ed coming out, or a piece coming out this week, where we say this isn't a restart at all. We call it more like a mountain climb, where this is going to take a couple years and it's going to be kind of jagged, and we really need to think through what that looks like. It's way too soon to be thinking about a recovery. And I would also say I am deeply suspicious of anybody who says that thing I've been advocating for 5 years is now more important than ever. So I'm going to avoid talking about all the great things we need to do on the environment, since I work for an environmental NGO. But will say that I am particularly concerned, and this goes somewhat to Brian's point, about what this current situation is doing to the mental health, particularly the mental health of children. It's a real gap in our system, and I'll leave it to Monica and the sort of medical side to figure out what the correct policy response is here. But I think we really need to do something. Like the number of parents I talk to about, you know, their kids are having nightmares or depressed because they can't see their friends, and all of these things that are going on. I think that's a real gap in our system that, you know, OHIP largely doesn't, you know, the Ontario health system doesn't largely cover the brain. Is an issue that's showing up even more so in this crisis. So I think that's something we need to be thinking about, because it's not just our, you know, to Brian's point, it's not just our incomes that are suffering. It's our quality of life. And, you know, for a lot of kids out there, it's their mental health.
Monica or yeah, Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, I totally agree with Mike on that. I think it's important to keep that stuff at the forefront of our mind, that whenever we're talking about economic policy, economics is simply the sort of activities of human people, sort of production in a frugal way, right? So we're talking about a whole person. There's a real challenge there. I want to just ask one question about, you know, Professor Robson was talking about the challenges with government policy and the way in which they're normally built. And we build them that way on purpose, and partially because of great economists like her who say, look, we need to measure the effects of this. Is it working? And we have to have a whole thing together. And God bless all of you guys for that. That's one of the reasons why Canada is such a great country. I think there's some interesting stuff that we can, or at least places we can look around the world where programs are delivered. We have basically our income supports are delivered primarily federally. Canada's a huge country, 10 provinces, 3 territories, covering everything from Newfoundland and Labrador to, you know, Iqaluit to Punky Doodle's Corners, right, Mike? If he may be one of 3 people in the world who knows where that is. But there's a sense in which there's a tremendous array of differences in those markets, whether they're labor markets or what have you. My friend Charles Churtwell, who's in Northern Ontario, said, look, things are different in Northern Ontario than they are in London, than they are in New Brunswick. And yet still, we're trying to do this from the federal level. It's interesting to think about, and again, this is not a silver bullet, and this is not a hobby. It's a bit of a hobby horse of mine, Mike, so you can tell me but in places like Denmark, for instance, the unions are the ones that distribute employment insurance benefits. And that's just the way the government does that. And there are other places in Europe that do that as well. And what's interesting about that is that there's a sort of a flow through. It's the government enables labor organizations to do that, which in turn provides a reason for labor organizations to get together to work on behalf of their members. But what's unique about that is that it provides a very, very low level, and I don't mean that in the sense of sort of hierarchical, I mean that in the sense it's close to the ground. Those unions know the needs of workers, those labor markets, and can respond in ways and hold those members accountable and be held accountable in ways that it's sometimes a little tougher to do at the federal level. And so, you know, as I said earlier, we should be contemplating ways in which we can properly use the power, the tremendous powers, fiscal powers, I think, that are rightfully present at the federal level, and have them work in ways that are distributed and accountable, that is not like some libertarian get a government get out, but ways that actually uses civil society in ways that it's best suited to do.
Yeah, and maybe let me just add to that. And when we have a massive income support program delivered federally to individuals or to companies, you don't get that nuance. You know, there seems to be a bit of and Jennifer referred earlier to the relative lack of take-up of the emergency wage subsidy. Something that's really interesting to observe right now is the growth in solidarity that we're getting as part of these efforts. But it doesn't always translate or connect to what's happening with government or in policymaking. So you've got policymaking that isn't always connected to that sense of solidarity. You'll see money going to food banks, to some intermediaries, but not in the same way to develop the kind of connection or solidarity that Brian is maybe talking about. Monica, did you want to weigh on this? And then I'll do one more question on Slido.
Yeah, I was thinking about, of course, I have certain policy areas that I think are key. You know, another one that I've been thinking a lot about is internet access, which from the very beginning of all of the shutdown I work mainly with rural and small communities, and of course also in urban areas this comes up, but that's another one. At the same time, I also think that a bigger issue is that, you know, all of the policy options kind of build on the fact that there are so many things broken in the system we have, and we're trying to patch it up and make things better, which I do think we need to do at the same time. When we look at the type of work that's valued in terms of who does it and how much they get paid, different areas like that, I think that's really come out with the personal support workers that were mentioned, with the people who work in, you know, meatpacking plants, who tend to be, you know, new immigrants and newcomers to Canada. It just, unless we very actively through this, I'm trying not to say reopening or rebuilding and use a word without which I can't think of, but unless we actively do try to make those changes as we go forward now, we're just going to fall into the same traps that we were in before, that were created by, you know, decades and centuries of you know, oppressive systems that have created where we are now. But places are doing that. You know, there's, you know, Hawaii, there's an example of what does a feminist agenda look like when we go for, you know, places like Australia and New Zealand are trying to look at, if we had well-being as the center of our rebuilding, what does that look like? So I do think it's possible, even in the crisis moment as we go forward, to put together principles that really guide in order to try to address some of those inequities that have existed and will still exist if we don't actively look at them now.
Thank you. We've got a couple of questions on Slido, which bring us back down to the programs and less about the systems change side. And I think that's a fundamental tension we're going to be dealing with for a while. So let me come back to those and see the response to that from the panel. A couple questions, and feel free to take either one of these. What is the first of the major programs to be unwound, and how would we do it? And what's the most effective way to learn from these programs and improve on them, as opposed to just politicizing them? So again, we're talking about the current suite of programs. And you can reject the premises of the question if you like as well in taking on, in responding.
I'll take the really simple one, the student benefit, because by September, most of those students will no longer have needed a summer job. So that's the lowest of low-hanging fruit.
I was going to say stand by for a potential political moment with that one, because you're starting to see a little bit of momentum around students who are saying, okay, and I'm going to come back and pay the same tuition in September for an online offering. Maybe I need some other recognition of that at least.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be an issue, and something the provinces are going to have to think about is how to make colleges and universities whole, because enrollments are likely down. International enrollments, which pay a lot of the bills at our schools, are going to be down significantly. That's going to be a big issue that I don't think anyone's talking about. And again, they pay my salary, so I'm not a disinterested observer on this one. But I think it's important because once we come out of this mountain climb or restart or what have you, there's going to be a skills mismatch in our economy. We're going to have a fairly high level of unemployment. So on the one hand, we've got these universities and colleges which are going to be facing, a big financial crunch. At the same time, when the demand for their services are going to be up even higher. So that's, we can leave that for another webinar, but that's a big thing that provincial governments need to be thinking about.
Yeah, and in general, there's a human capital development plan that does not seem to exist coming out of this. There's income without human capital development. So. Anyone else on programs that could be unwound first and or learned from? Jennifer?
So I would say one of the, Mike stole mine for the easiest to unwind. But maybe I can take the second part of that question, which was about how do we learn best for them? Yes. And that's where I would really love to see much more open and transparent data on who is actually making use of the programs right now, seeing if we can do a better job of linking to administrative records to find out what impacts that they are having. And by making it open and transparent, it means that actually more people, this isn't just a self-interested, oh gosh, I'm an academic, I really want more data. It's a genuine, when you make the data more publicly available, it becomes much easier for you to basically outsource a lot of your analysis. And then smart people like Brian, like Mike, like Monica can dig in and actually figure out what has been working, what hasn't, and then make smart recommendations for how to do better in the future. So that would be one simple thing that I think would make a big difference in the next couple of months.
Okay. Policymakers who are on this call, note that, Jennifer. Thank you. Anyone else on this question? Brian?
Just very briefly, I think if we're talking about unwinding them soon, I think it's unlikely it's going to be soon. I know Mike said that, Jennifer said that, but I do think there's going to be. I don't think there's. My kids keep asking me, when is this going to be over? As if when can we go back? As if it's just like that we're going to be able to go back to church, back to school, all the things that we used to do. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that same thing is going to happen in the labor force. I don't think it's going to happen, bang, that we go back and we can just suddenly wind up CERB, particularly for people in certain sectors and for instance, certain people in self-employed. It's going to take a little bit of time to get those businesses, those things that used to be on the fringe for certain businesses said, yeah, we can do this because we're growing, or we're doing this because we want to innovate, try new things. I think those workers are going to have a difficult time to return quickly. And I think therefore we should be thinking in terms of weaning ourselves off of some of these programs rather than flicking a switch.
So there's a special, and each benefit might have its own considerations, right? So the emergency response benefit, which is at a certain level, but allows you to earn a certain level of income. Maybe those parameters need to be tweaked, but you still keep a version of the benefit at a lower maximum amount. Is that an example?
I bet Professor Robson could come up with a really great, give her some time and I bet she'd do a good job of
that. I don't know if I would, it's not an easy problem to fix, right? Like my working hypothesis here, and I have yet to be proven wrong on this, is that we can either figure out ways of paying people money quickly, right, with limited delays, which is one thing that CERB actually did for the vast majority of cases, did reasonably well. Or we can figure out ways of, for example, having very gradual clawbacks based on different earnings disregards, that kind of thing. We could design something that's based more like the Canada Workers Benefit that actually temporarily increases benefits until you hit some ceiling threshold and then that decreases, right? So you actually have a front-end work incentive component to it. But all of that stuff is really, really hard to do and pay millions of people benefits quickly, right? So now we're going to be facing some trade-offs between some degree of simplicity of the benefits that can be actually administered, but then we're actually losing some of that potential for that nuance around fine-tuning who gets what, right, and creating incentives. Or we can focus more on creating those incentives and think about greater targeting. And we're going to have to accept that it's going to take a lot longer for people to actually get access to the help that they need. And that's not an easy trade-off for policymakers to have to walk.
Yeah, not an easy trade-off. And then the imperfectness of our systems and of our understanding, even of how things are playing out in different places. So really, really important feedback, which maybe to pick up on Mike's point should also chasten all of us in terms of the advice that we're either giving in sweeping ways. It's important to have this iterative sense of what's been happening. And that's another thing to observe to the question of when will this end? Well, the tweaking of policy sounds like will be something that we'll continue to do for months and months, even as these policies change or wind down. With that, there's been a number of great questions that are still on the Slido related to basic income in particular, and to the future of some of the social programs. I think right now, what we'd like to do is to now go into breakout rooms. So we'll go into breakout rooms for about between 15 and 20 minutes. Each of you will be joined by a first policy response moderator. The participants will be, you'll be put in a room with a moderator and a first policy and a panelist. And then we'll come back together for the last 5 minutes to share any conclusions. And again, the opportunity through these breakout rooms is to interact in a more intimate way, to put specific questions to the person you're placed in, and to join in the discussion in a more interactive way. So with that, we'll go into breakout rooms, and then we'll come back at 5 minutes to 3. Welcome back. I really appreciate people staying into overtime here. We're going to get report backs from each of the rooms from the moderators and the panelists. So let's start with Matthew.
Well, I'll just take 1 minute. We had a really good conversation on vulnerable people, public health, childcare, and I'd say two issues that I would just highlight that I think are really important. One, we just started talking about the enormity of the challenge of reopening or restarting, and how the childcare, education, summer camp, children at home, people unable to work. People are talking about it, but we probably are still underestimating the enormity of the challenge, because people kind of want to be optimistic and put some of this stuff behind us. And so everyone's talking about reopening and restarting and getting back to work. But as we talked about throughout the panel and in our breakout session, for families with kids at home, that just isn't a realistic solution at the moment. And we had a really good conversation on federalism and the role of the federal government, and also kind of the beginning of trade-offs between things like a UBI and a widespread employment insurance system that covers more people, that covers the self-employed and gig workers, and Clearly, government will start to, experiment and explore with some of these programs and how they can be phased in or phased out or made permanent or rolled back. But pretty soon, we're not going to just have 1,000. We're going to start to make choices about how governments are going to invest in income support. And that might be a UBI, it might be expanded, or it might be something else.
Great. Thank you so much, Matthew. Stephanie.
Thanks, Karim. We had a very good conversation as well. A few things, main ideas that we touched on. The first is the question of why are there so many programs? And is it a matter of, if somebody has, like, if an industry has a really good lobbying team, or do they get a special benefit when otherwise they might not? And then related to that, does that lock in sectors that might not necessarily, be well served staying in the economy? So for instance, the retail sector, are there a lot of brick and mortar stores that we might not need to, that maybe if they don't survive this, maybe there's a good reason for that, economically speaking. Same goes for companies that are environmentally harmful and high carbon producing industries. So there's a question of whether the benefits that we put in place now will lock in some of these industries. Second thing that came up was kind of related to that, the idea of, with all these different benefits programs, it can be really tricky for people to navigate, especially if they are on the, more lower income, more vulnerable, and have difficulties accessing the system in the first place. So we talked about whether there could be a way of making that easier to access. And one thing that came out of that was the idea of, similar to what Matthew said about federalism, having the different levels of government administering different programs. And we talked about whether there's whether the crisis has exposed some flaws in the system, with it being as fractured as it is, and whether provinces or municipalities should be getting more support in this in exchange for uploading some of the programs they're administering right now. So it was a lot of good questions, a lot of not many answers yet, but I think we identified some good areas to consider as we move forward.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. Sahar.
Yeah. So we also had a lot of questions and discussion. So one piece was about the importance of needing more evidence and information about what's been happening and how we can identify pain points and how to make policies moving forward. So for example, there's significant information we need about labor markets, especially considering there's a huge impact on the care economy, and we need rapid signals back to the supply side of talent to make policies accordingly. We also talked about the importance of a portable and flexible approach to benefits rather than paying first and claiming on taxes later, since a lot of people are facing the pinch on their wallets right now. We had a discussion about childcare as well, and Kate Bezanson shared that there is an appetite for collaborative federalism that we haven't seen in a really long time, and also that childcare has the attention at the federal level in a way that hasn't existed before. So there's a lot of opportunity there. And then the last few pieces included how this is a recession that's different from any other we've ever seen before, because usually recessions have been based on financial systems, whereas this one is based on a healthcare system. And so there's a lot of implications because of that. And lastly, we touched on opportunities to improve EI systems in the future, because we have learned about what the gaps are through going through this process with CERB and all the other supports.
Thank you, Sahar. And that's Sahar Shafiq and Stephanie McClellan, who are the managing editors of First Policy Response. Open to your pitches. Email policyresponse@ryerson.ca. And earlier that was Matthew Mendelson, one of the co-founders of First Policy Response with the Ryerson Leadership Lab and the Brookfield Institute for Innovation and Entrepreneurship. In our session, we had some similar themes, especially around the relative roles of governments, and a bit of a discussion around the built environment, how the built environment is really rethinking how we plan and design building in cities. Is going to be really important to deliver the kind of childcare and long-term care that we might need, or at least the services for seniors and children that we might need in this intermittent period and then beyond. Really wonderful conversation. Thank you so many of you for joining us till 3 o'clock. Thank you, Monica, Jennifer, Mike, and Brian for your expertise. and for your really thoughtful interventions. Thanks to all of you for joining us.